Today, we are here to discuss how climate change intensifies impacts on children, leaving them sensitive to changes to their developmental systems. This webinar will delve into how environmental changes like extreme heat, air pollution, natural disasters, and food and water insecurity affect child health, learning, and well-being. We'll explore the latest science on these risks and how climate change exacerbates social and economic inequities. Our goal together is to raise awareness and identify strategies to build child resilience in a changing climate. We are excited to have Lindsey Burghardt present. At the Center for the Developing Child, Lindsey develops the scientific agenda by identifying emerging areas of interest, specializing in the impact of environments and climate on young children's health. We are in excellent hands with Lindsey. Lindsey, please take it away.
Thanks, Shruti, and thank you to the organizers and everyone for your time today. So I'm always going to take what is, a dicey minute to share my screen, and we'll get going. So hopefully everybody can see the first slide here.
Looks good.
Looks good? Okay, great. Thanks for the validation. So I'm going to talk today about how climate change is affecting children's developmental environments. And see, there we go, slides advancing. So to start, I'm just going to briefly describe the Center on the Developing Child and our work in this space. The center is an interfaculty initiative, so we actually sit between the School of Public Health and the Graduate School of Education. I'm a practicing primary care pediatrician, and then I also work at the center as our chief science officer. And our mission really is to leverage the power of the incredible science that you all do in pursuit of really better outcomes for young kids, particularly those that are facing adversity. And really what we want to do is bring this scientific understanding to policymakers and to all the other audiences with the goal of really shifting mindsets about why it's so important to protect children early and how supporting healthy pregnancies and healthy early years can really get kids off on the best start to life. And so in doing this, we're really hoping that we can catalyze changes in policy, increase services and funding to really make sure that all kids can thrive together with their caregivers in environments that support their healthy development. So after we discuss this science around climate change and children's health, I'm also going to spend just a few minutes sharing with you what we've learned about some strategic public health communications strategies and really the power of framing in shifting mindsets, including around how we can protect kids from the effects of climate change. So when we want to understand why and how climate change affects children's health, we need to start by thinking really broadly about what influences their development. And so in young children, beginning well before birth, their development is shaped by the full range of all the exposures and the experiences that they have in the places where they live, they learn, they play, and they grow. And we call this the developmental environment. And in early childhood, biological systems are constantly reading the environment, and they actually develop in response to what they read. So for example, there's studies that show that early life exposure to certain types of air pollution may raise the risk of developing asthma later in childhood, and that this might occur because of pathways like inflammation and altered immune system development, or even increased allergic sensitization in kids who are exposed to this pollution. So developmental environments can contain these experiences and exposures that actually fuel positive development. So think of everything from responsive and reliable, consistent caregiving to high quality care and early education services, to breathing clean air and drinking clean water and having access to green space or having a comfortable temperature in the place where you sleep. Or they can have sources of exposures and experiences that are more likely to derail healthy development. So things like absent or unreliable caregiving, or physical or emotional abuse, or drinking contaminated water that contains lead, or exposure to extreme heat. So these developmental environments really shape a wide range of outcomes, both for young children and also for the adults that they become. And this includes their physical health, but it's also their mental health and their learning and their social and emotional well-being. So where we live as infants and when we're young children affects what we're exposed to, and then of course the types of experiences that we have. And this in turn affects our developing biological systems. So climate change is coming in now and affecting these environments in many ways and at multiple levels. It's affecting the social environment, but also the built and natural environments that are surrounding children in these early years. And we saw this, for example, like Hurricane Harvey in 2017, when there were 1.4 million kids who missed at least a week of school, and then 650 childcare centers or programs that were reported damaged or destroyed. So we're understanding now from years of this developmental science how different aspects of the built and natural environment either protect or put kids at increased risk from climate-related exposures. And this really matters because then when we start to think about solutions for protecting young children and families, there's a much broader range of policy domains that contribute to learning and health and well-being beyond what's within the influence of early childhood systems. And when it comes to the effect of climate change and all of the other experiences and exposures that kids have in developmental environments, timing really, really matters. And we're all sensitive and responsive to our environments, but development is a process that evolves in ways that make certain age ranges especially sensitive to environments. And what this means is that the exposures and the experiences that kids have in developmental environments where they live during this time are really, really powerful in influencing children's health now, but also importantly across their lifetime and as much older adults. And so in general, sensitivity in the prenatal period is the greatest. And that prenatal sensitivity is greater than in early childhood. And young children are in turn more sensitive than most adolescents. And adolescents are more sensitive to exposures than many adults. And this is important because when it comes to both solutions and actions, it's not just what we do and whether or not we do it, but when we're stepping in to support young children, that is really important. And that's really informed by what developmental science is telling us. And then this differential sensitivity also means that there's sort of this good news, bad news when it comes to kids and exposures like extreme heat and water-related climate effects and wildfire smoke. And that anything we do to protect pregnant people and fetal development and very young children early, when these biological systems are most sensitive, is really likely to have an outsized, very positive effect on all of the outcomes that we care about, physical health, mental health, across the life course. But then the converse is also true, right? If we don't step in to protect pregnant people and children during these sensitive periods, we're also really likely to see an outsized negative effect on those same outcomes, their health across the lifespan. And when we want to think about the importance of this differential timing and sensitivity, we can take heat as an example. So prenatally, we'll get into this in more detail later, but exposure to extreme heat can lead to outcomes like prematurity or low birth weight. And then these can then go on to heighten the risk of a range of adverse outcomes across the life course. So impaired cognition, reduced growth, risk of diabetes, and cardiovascular disease in adulthood. But exposure to extreme heat in infancy has different effects. We can see infants experiencing chronically disrupted or dysregulated sleep, which has implications both on infant and caregiver mental health. And then if you look at exposure to extreme heat in childhood or adolescence, we can see flare-ups of asthma in kids who have that condition. And so these differential effects are because the effect of heat on children's development is really dependent on the timing during development when the exposure occurs. So again, developmental science is really useful, not only in helping us to understand how things work, but it's also revealing really what we need to do to make them work better. So it's a really good example of a time when science is pointing us towards solutions. And it's important when we're thinking about children and the effects of climate change to consider that these effects are both direct, but there's also really important and cascading indirect pathways. So for example, when we think about direct effects on children, we can think about, like I mentioned, extreme heat causing more flare-ups of asthma in kids who already have asthma, or breathing in wildfire smoke leading to worsening of that same condition, or the variety of effects of extreme heat on pregnancy and birth outcomes. But then these indirect effects are also really, really important. And there's so many more than we can get into today in both of these categories. But the indirect effects in particular may include things like heat waves causing heat illness or heat-related deaths in caregivers, which then really negatively impacts their ability to care for the young children under their care. Or when we think about schools closing because of extreme heat and then all these days lost of learning. So the negative developmental impacts of climate change, as many of us know, are not evenly or randomly distributed, but they flow through and they amplify these really long-standing inequalities in children's access to safe and secure housing, to our urban planning policies, to community infrastructure, and to economic opportunities in their neighborhoods. So because, for example, of long-standing lack of investment in previously redlined neighborhoods, these areas are much less well equipped to withstand the effect of extreme weather events today, and residents are more likely to be forced to leave their homes when these events occur. Now, getting more precise about these existing inequalities for children is really helping us to understand where climate change is already having and is likely to go on to have the greatest impact on young kids. And this is really important because it informs our solution space. So there's something called the Child Opportunity Index, and this was developed by our colleagues at Diversity Data Kids. It's now in the 3rd version, and many of you might be familiar with it already, but it's a composite index, and it measures and maps the quality of resources and conditions in kids' neighborhoods. And amazingly, it has data from every census tract in the US. The 3rd edition is between the years of 2012 and 2021, and there's 44 different indicators across 3 domains of education, health and the environment, and social and economic influences. But the COI is just one way that researchers are trying to become really precise about quantifying both positive and negative influences in developmental environments, and then also their impacts. So it considers the types of resources and the conditions in the neighborhoods where kids are living, and then their corresponding access to opportunities or lack thereof that they have to support their healthy development. And these elements are things like proximity to access to green space, which they measure via nature score, exposure to risk factors like hazardous waste and PM 2.5 and ozone and extreme heat. And I think the COI is so helpful because it recognizes compounding benefits that you get from multiple sources of advantage. And then conversely, it also really helps to illustrate compounding risks of multiple sources of adversity. So for example, it's able to identify neighborhoods that have better educational opportunities and healthier physical environments and more economic and social resources. And so a lot of studies which are still very useful in using single indicators, like things like neighborhood poverty rates to represent neighborhood sources of resources or disadvantage, are really useful, but sometimes single indicators can fail to capture how really multidimensional and intersecting and cumulative these neighborhood influences are that are really powerful in shaping children's development. And this is really important because it's helping us to understand already where children have multiple sources of resilience against the effects of climate change and where we really need to step in collectively to lean in and protect them. An analysis of the COI data shows that there's really significant geographical differences across the US. Here in New England and some of the Great Plains states, we have metro areas with some of the highest COI scores, so the most opportunity, those are the darkest areas on the map. And then if you look at the Central Valley of California and a lot of the southern states, there's more metro areas with some of the lowest opportunity scores in the country. So if you look even within these regions, the COI is able to show us really dramatic differences between neighborhoods, even in the same region. And it shows really how structural racism has led to this opportunity hoarding in more affluent, in predominantly white communities, and a concentration of disadvantage in many Black and Hispanic communities. The COI scores range from 0 to 100. 0 would be a very low opportunity neighborhood, and 100 a very high opportunity neighborhood score. And when we take a closer look at the distribution of COI scores, the index shows us that Black and Hispanic children across the US are more than 7 and 5 times more likely, respectively, to live in one of the very low opportunity neighborhoods compared with white children. So if you look, for instance, and zoom in, and we can pick an example of Milwaukee. For example, the typical white child lives in a neighborhood with a COI score of 85 out of 100, while the typical Black child lives in a neighborhood with a COI score of 6. And throughout the country, these patterns are consistent in that Black and Hispanic children live in neighborhoods with much lower COI scores than white and Asian children. And for the 100 largest metro areas combined, which you can see on the graph here, the COI score that the typical white child enjoys is 74 compared to 77 for Asian children, 33 for Hispanic children, and 30 for Black children. So the COI is letting us answer questions like, in a given metro area, even in a state across a country, which neighborhoods have the highest and lowest levels of child opportunity? And then how big is the gap between high and low opportunity neighborhoods, even within and between these different metro areas? And this is really important when it comes to climate, because it's one way that we can really start to understand how children in different neighborhoods will experience extreme heat, wildfires, water-related effects of climate. So the way that environments for children are affected by climate change really depends on the ways in which these environments were designed. Now, there's specific areas of children's developmental environments where climate change is having really strong effects. And there's more than we can cover in our conversation today, but the big buckets that we'll try to delve into are air, primarily with regards to wildfire smoke and worsening of outdoor, but also really importantly, indoor air quality, because much of our outdoor air, depending on the structure that we live in, gets inside. Water via cascading effects of water, both in terms of over and under availability, and then the effects that that can have on drinking water. And temperature, so both extreme heat and extreme cold in developmental environments, but today we're just going to be able to focus on extreme heat. Now, it's probably not a surprise that clean air is an essential ingredient in positive developmental environments, but making sure that kids have clean air and that there's clean air surrounding pregnant people is a really vital strategy, again, indoors as well as outdoors, that we can take in supporting kids' healthy development. And it's important to know that infants and young children are more affected by air pollution than many adults because their physiology is unique. So they breathe more times per minute compared to most adults. They inhale a larger volume of air relative to their smaller body size. And as we talked about earlier, their biological systems are still developing. When it comes to wildfires, many of us know that wildfires generate these very small particles that can travel thousands of miles from the source, and they affect the health of children over a really wide geographic area. And when kids breathe in wildfire smoke, actually less of the contamination is trapped in their noses compared to us. And so more of these particles reach their lungs and their lower lungs, and there they can trigger inflammation and cause kids to develop a variety of respiratory illnesses like pneumonia. Now, exposure to wildfire smoke also causes more children to develop asthma, and it increases emergency room visits for kids who already have asthma, as well as for other respiratory illnesses. And there's studies actually demonstrating that exposure to PM 2.5 and carbon monoxide and ozone over time is actually linked to increased rates of DNA methylation. And this can lead to changes in gene expression that can actually be passed down to future generations. And this air pollution exposure also really correlates with an increase in certain types of white blood cells called monocytes that play a really key role in the buildup of plaque in our arteries, which can lead children to have an increased risk of developing heart disease in adulthood. And so wildfire smoke actually really importantly and surprisingly sometimes affects learning. There's a nationwide study looking at smoke exposure in the year leading up to a test. And the more smoke exposure there was significantly decreased student test scores. And the more smoke exposure that a child experienced, the lower the score on average. Now, in pregnancy, exposure to wildfire smoke, as well as in early childhood, can have a really significant negative impact, again, on healthy deliveries and health, both in the short term and in the long-term health effects with kids. So during pregnancy, wildfire smoke can trigger an inflammatory response, and it's linked to gestational hypertension and can lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes, everything from preeclampsia to low birth weight and preterm birth. And there's one study in California over a 6-year period that showed there were nearly 7,000 excess preterm births that were attributable just to wildfire smoke. A lot of us know about the importance of access to clean drinking water, but this is one of the cases where water availability and its quality has these cascading and multiplying effects across multiple domains of child development. So it's a really important one to dig into. Now, climate change is affecting both the availability, but also the quality of drinking water. And this is happening through a number of mechanisms. So first, we're seeing groundwater source drinking water is getting more contaminated, largely because of standing floodwaters that leak into wellheads, that percolate into well fields. And then we also are seeing fertilizers and pesticides that are making their way into water supplies because flooding is washing over agricultural areas. And this is leading to high levels of nitrogen in the groundwater as well. There's also changes in snowpack and snowmelt that are changing the availability of fresh water. And we're seeing microbial contamination of well water that's getting worse from rising temperatures. And kids are particularly sensitive to these waterborne microbial contaminants. You can think of everything from Giardia to Cryptosporidium to E. coli because their immune systems are less well developed than ours. We're also seeing droughts increasing the concentration of a variety of different contaminants in drinking water. And it's really important to think about this with respect to prenatal development, because neurotoxicants in drinking water during that time actually can disrupt hormones and proteins that are driving the construction of fetal brain architecture. Now, our brain is protected by toxic chemicals in adulthood by this protective membrane that regulates chemicals flowing in and out of your brain. But this membrane isn't fully developed during the prenatal and early infancy period. And so these contaminants are just more likely to cross into fetal brains during these times. And this can have really lifelong impacts. So one example that many people are familiar with is lead. Lead freely crosses the placenta, and we know that exposure of pregnant people, even to low levels of lead, can really significantly impact fetal development. Nitrates have also been found to have adverse health effects for infants when mother's water supply exceeds the US safety levels. And this is more common in areas with private wells. And then nitrates in well water also really importantly carry a risk of methemoglobinemia, a condition that can displace oxygen from baby's blood. And this happens in infants whose formula is mixed with well water that's contaminated by nitrates. And then contaminants like arsenic are also commonly found and increasingly concentrated in well water. And chronic exposure to arsenic can have a variety of effects. In the short term, largely GI symptoms of vomiting, diarrhea, and belly pain. But in the long term, we worry about neurological outcomes like learning disabilities, behavioral difficulties, certain types of cancer, and lowered IQ. Now, the increasing frequency and intensity of the extreme weather events that we're seeing can have direct effects on children, just like in adults. So they can experience injury and drowning and illness. But really importantly, in children, the stress and the trauma from displacement and from unpredictability actually can cause changes in their developing brain architecture. And this can lead to higher rates of a variety of mental health disorders like anxiety and PTSD. And these water-related events are a really good example of the range of indirect effects on children's development through the effects that it has on their caregivers. So when extreme weather events damage housing or infrastructure and families are displaced, this can cause really important major life disruptions in accessing education, in accessing healthcare, including routine and on-time childhood vaccinations, and food access, and all these other essential services that kids and their caregivers depend on. And caregivers, of course, can be affected by direct injury, physical injury, drowning, or they can suffer the loss of their jobs or their social support networks. And when caregivers experience these adverse mental health effects as a result of displacement, when they experience anxiety, depression, if they're affected by PTSD, these effects then impact children's development by affecting, again, that caregiver's ability to provide not only basic needs like food or housing, but also really importantly for child development, daily structure, routine, responsive caregiving, all these elements of the social environment that we know are such critical ingredients in promoting healthy development. Now, climate change is increasing temperatures in developmental environments, and this has a really wide range of effects. And kids, again, have a unique physiology that affects the way that they experience extreme heat. So all of our bodies respond to heat in a couple of ways. First, we redistribute blood flow to our skin, and this lets heat transfer out of the body into the environment. And then also we sweat. But in young children, they don't sweat as much as adults. And so this first method, the blood flow cooling method, is really especially important. And it's effective only as long as the air temperature is cooler than the body's temperature, so that heat can dissipate out from their bodies into the environment. Oh, it's giving me an alert. There we go. And then additionally, kids and young children can't seek out cooler environments, and they can't get water to drink when they're thirsty without first relying on adults. So in the news and in policy circles, we tend to hear, and rightly so, a lot about the impacts of heat on the elderly, and especially those who are isolated. And then we hear oftentimes generations of discussions of heat effects on our population as a whole. And we think about measures like emergency room utilization rates for heat stress and heat stroke, because these measures are often accessible and they're really informative. But when we kind of broaden to start to consider the effects of extreme heat on prenatal and early childhood development, I think we can really recognize a much broader set of health outcomes that are right now, I think, oftentimes being underestimated in a lot of our current conversations about the effects of heat on health. And when it comes to the effects of extreme heat on young children, there are important effects. Again, we're seeing a theme here, both in the moment, but also across their lifespan. In kids, a lot of the effects of heat are invisible. And I think this is in part what makes them perhaps receive less attention in the public or in policy circles. But when we draw attention to them, it sort of opens up this huge range of additional solutions. And the effect of increased temperatures on these developmental environments, the immediate effects on kids, they still experience heat stress and heat stroke like older adults. And actually their small bodies heat up more quickly than ours. But they also experience this range of other effects on fetal development, on learning, on sleep, and on their mental and behavioral health. But luckily, there are things that we know work to help keep more kids safe from these threats. And there's already communities and cities that are implementing them with really good effect. Now, in times of extreme heat, there's normal physiologic changes that happen during pregnancy, but these changes can actually create additional risk, both to the fetus and to the pregnant person. So during pregnancy, our bodies already produce more heat. There's increased metabolism that we need to support fetal development. And then also there's increased strain from additional body mass. And these protective mechanisms during pregnancy are there to compensate for changes. So there's a lower threshold for sweating, an increase in blood flow to the skin. But when there's extreme heat, these adaptations can be overwhelmed. And there's a couple of mechanisms by which extreme heat may lead to preterm birth. So, for example, high temperatures may result in reduced blood flow to the placenta, in addition to dehydration and inflammation, all of which can trigger preterm birth. And this is really important because preterm birth doesn't just raise the risk of a baby of dying or becoming ill in infancy, but it also carries this greater risk for a range of adverse outcomes that I mentioned briefly earlier later in life: impaired cognition, reduced growth, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. So if we don't take targeted actions to protect pregnant people from the effects of heat, I think we'll see more and more babies be born prematurely. And we will feel that impact in the NICUs and in the hospitals, but also in our schools and then in the adult medical care system when these premature infants reach adulthood. And so in the US, these adverse pregnancy outcomes of being preterm or early term probably affect around, depending on which numbers you look at, 10% of our babies. And so if we look at 300 to 400,000 babies already affected annually in the United States, and then we take a factor like extreme heat that's going to increase that number even just a little bit, this could have huge implications for public health. Again, both right now, but also in the future when these babies reach adulthood. So when we protect pregnant people from the effects of extreme heat, we can just make sure that more babies are making it to full term to start out life on a healthy track. When it comes to learning, heat's linked to slower cognitive function and a reduced concentration ability, which we can all appreciate. If we were listening and having this conversation in a room that was 105 degrees, our brains would feel and react a lot differently. And so we think that learning loss probably occurs because the heat's effect on the brain creates these slower reaction times and a reduced ability to concentrate. And also learning in a hot classroom just makes students, but also their teachers, feel really unmotivated, distracted, irritable. And we saw this: if schools are uncomfortably hot, they can be forced to close early or even for days at a time. And for the past few years, this has been really important when kids in the US, even in places that are typically cool, like Philadelphia, Boston, Michigan, miss multiple days of school when high temperatures forced schools to close early or to be closed for several days at a time because the infrastructure was not in place to cool them. And this is really important because the number of missed school days and learning losses that will accrue from not being in school or from being in school on hot days without air conditioning, these number of days will likely increase if we don't cool classrooms, and also really importantly, early care and education centers where babies and our tiniest learners learn. And so based on the studies that we have now, a 1 degree Fahrenheit hotter school year reduces student learning by a percentage point. And if we see a sustained increase in temperatures of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, this will reduce the average year's learning by 7%. And the good news is that cooling does seem to mitigate at least some of these effects. And we see student performance increase on average by about 20% if you cool a classroom temperature from 86 degrees Fahrenheit air temperature to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, sleep is a pillar of health. I think we all feel that on a personal level, and getting good, sufficient, high quality sleep is just essential for kids' healthy development. And when we see chronic or repeated sleep deficits in infants and in children, this can raise their likelihood of developing emotional and behavioral challenges, as well as disrupted language development, and it actually affects their problem-solving skills. Now, a lot of us are familiar with the role of light in helping us fall asleep, but temperature actually plays a really integral role in sleep quality for all of us as well. So as our bodies get ready to fall asleep, our core temperature typically drops, and this helps us to fall asleep. But if there's high external temperatures, this core body drop can't happen, and this can lead to potentially negative outcomes for kids. So a study looking at the effects of heat on infant sleep during a heat wave found that when the temperatures were ranging from 96 to about 102 degrees, the babies took longer to fall asleep. They had less total sleep, less efficient sleep. It was more fragmented. And anyone who's cared for an infant overnight knows that if their sleep is more fragmented, yours is too. And so in the same study, the good news is following the heat wave, the baby's sleep patterns rebounded. And this shows us, and it demonstrates, the negative impacts of one heat wave are not permanent, and we can remediate them pretty quickly by reducing infants' exposure to heat in the future. So because children's brains and bodies are still developing and they're highly sensitive to their experience, this time of early childhood is a period where threats to well-being are really important, and they can have a long-lasting effect on children's mental health. So if there's excessive activation of the stress response system, both during pregnancy and in early childhood, this can actually disrupt the development of these healthy emotional regulation circuits in the developing brain of a child or a fetus. And this is really important because these circuits provide the foundation for all of the higher level social emotional functioning that comes later in life. Now, we also see excessive heat increasing rates of violent crime and conflict and suicide. This is probably through a combination of factors, both behavioral. When it's hot, more people are outside, but there's also biological changes that happen because heat can actually disrupt the hormones and the neurotransmitters that stabilize our mood, and this can make us feel more irritable or even more aggressive. It's really important for young kids because these experiences of violence are really potent activators of the stress response system in young children and during pregnancy. And this again can cause long-lasting trauma and a decreased sense both of physical and psychological safety and well-being. Now, because young kids, again, are so powerfully affected by their environments and these relationships around them, there's good news in that any efforts we make that are going to decrease or ameliorate the effects of heat in a community are also going to mitigate the factors that contribute to the development of these mental and behavioral health problems in kids. So for example, if we work to decrease heat in urban heat islands, this is also going to let more people exercise outdoors, which improves both children and caregivers' mental and physical health and their social connectedness. Now, it's really important too on a high level that increased temperatures in developmental environments do something critical in that they just limit a child's ability to explore, to create, to play. And we don't measure these things necessarily too often in public health, but they're really essential elements to healthy development. Now, when we think about strategies that address high temperatures and these other aspects of climate change, these are also strategies that almost uniformly are promoting healthy development in children. And we think about them at 3 levels. So first, it's protecting young kids and their caregivers from immediate threats. Second is thinking, how are we adapting our services, our systems, and our infrastructure to better withstand climate change effects that will continue, the effects on air, on water, and on temperature. And then third, how are we thinking about preventing future harm? So how are we addressing the root cause of climate change by really significantly reducing our fossil fuel combustion? When we think about strategies to reduce harm from air, we can start by thinking about monitoring local air quality. And the EPA's Air Now app is really great. We can think about partnering with schools, early care and education settings to help inform decision-making about when it might be safer actually to keep both kids and their caregivers inside. And then second, before wildfires even happen, making sure we have high quality air filters in place in the spots where babies and pregnant people and young children are spending time, making sure that we're including schools and early care settings, and ensuring that these systems are ready to operate both during and also after wildfires. Third is thinking about modernizing our affordable housing and situating these developments in the high opportunity neighborhoods that we talked about. And then citing schools in areas with less air pollution and providing funding that we can use to improve air quality in schools that are already in existing sites. So actually across the US, 1 in 11 schools are sited within 500 feet of a high volume road. But back in 2003, California enacted legislation that prevents new schools being built within this distance to prevent future problems with air quality. And when we expand legislation like this, and then also remediate schools that are currently within these zones, we're really taking a great opportunity to build resilience against climate change. Now, immediate actions to reduce harm from extreme weather events can include things like connecting with OB and pediatric providers to help make sure that we're notifying and including in our evacuation systems methods to reach pregnant people and caregivers of young children. And we can also think about improving the protections and enforcing them, or the protections that we already have, both at state and federal levels, by promoting equal enforcement, which doesn't currently exist, of these national water protection standards. And that'll help to reduce pregnant people and young children's exposure to these contaminants. And this includes making testing and filtration widely available. And I really like the example here of the state of New Hampshire. They provide free, private well water testing to low-income pregnant people who are participants of their special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children. And if there are high levels of heavy metal detected in the water supply, the state then provides free water filtration systems to these households. And then finally, we can think about combining improvements in gray and green infrastructure, and these can lead to some of the greatest improvements in water resilience. And green infrastructure in particular, so increasing tree canopies and building bioswales and installing green roofs and establishing green spaces near where children spend time, decreases water supply pollution by reducing runoff. It also lowers our flood risk. It reduces sewer overflow, and it's really good for child development. Now, when it comes to heat, again, making sure that our early warning systems are reaching the populations of pregnant people and caregivers of very young children is so important. And then making cooling centers both available and accessible for pregnant people and young children, and designing them with developmental environments in mind. And so libraries should not be bearing the sole responsibility for being child-friendly places to stay cool, but I do think that they serve as an example of the type of environment that caregivers want to access with young children. And then thinking about how do we adapt places where pregnant people and young children are spending time with heat pumps, with air conditioning, with green or cool roofs, or a combination of these technologies to actually make the temperatures comfortable inside. And again, increasing green space and focusing those efforts around early care and education centers and schools can be enormously beneficial. I mentioned it on the previous slide, but green space really has profound benefits across multiple domains of child development, and increasing green space in the places where kids are spending time and where they're learning, and thinking about how we can partner with communities to keep those spaces open outside of schools hours, I think is a really promising solution. So when we consider all these different ways that we can build resilience in children and promote healthy development, I think we need to start by broadening the list of policy domains that we're viewing as affecting child development, and how those different fields intersect with climate change. And fostering this cross-sector collaboration between whether it's environmental protection and housing, zoning, urban planning, economic development, and increasing collaborative efforts at the policy level, I think can really produce powerful results. But broadening this frame means that we really have to, as a society, start to consider in every decision we make, how those decisions will shape developmental environments. And we can bring this lens of what impact will this have on children into decision-making across sectors, because all of these decisions will affect and shape developmental environments. It's whether it does it for the better or the worse. This is really a chance to harness the power of what developmental science is telling us and bring it into policy. So just like all of these environments were designed by decisions that we made over time, we can redesign them to support healthy development and to protect kids from the effects of climate change. So I'll just take a minute to explain. In our work at our center, we've had a longstanding partnership with a nonprofit research organization called the Frameworks Institute. And if you work still in public health, I'd really encourage you to take a look at their work and at their website, because they've worked on a variety of issues that many of us in the virtual room today care about. And I've really experienced through this partnership how powerful it can be when we present key scientific findings about whether it's early childhood, environmental health, a range of other topics in really clear, accurate, and uniform ways when we're engaging with different policymakers. And framing is everywhere. It's choices that we make about what we say, how we say it, what we emphasize, and actually what we leave unsaid. And I think it affects how people hear us, it affects what they understand, how they feel, and also, really importantly, how they act as a result. So it affects whether we think of an issue as a personal problem, or whether we can garner support for something as a social concern that sort of demands collective action. So as an example, I'm just going to discuss some research and reasons around why we might consider alternatives to vulnerability framing. And these recommendations are from a video created by the Frameworks team to describe this issue, and you can check it out if you're interested on their website. So I think many of us might describe groups as vulnerable or at risk because we're trying to elicit compassion. So for example, we might say that children are vulnerable to the effects of climate change because we're trying to gather support to protect them. But actually what the Frameworks research has demonstrated is that describing groups, including children, as vulnerable or at risk, it does actually may elicit sympathy, but for a lot of research participants, it also really taps into stereotypes of weakness and even failure. And it reinforces this idea that some people's lives are just difficult and it is what it is. And so when Frameworks tested this vulnerability frame, they found that it actually doesn't motivate people to change systems or to change policies. And so if we want to effectively communicate about groups who deserve our protection, who are most affected by injustice, we really need to change our message from they need help to we need to solve this problem together. And we can do this in a couple of ways. First is by putting responsibility on the systems that cause harm. And so instead of talking about climate change affecting vulnerable children experiencing homelessness, we can talk about families who have been priced out of affordable and stable housing. And then we can focus on people's skills and strengths and avoid labels that suggest people are either burdened or that they're broken. And I think a helpful example here is the widespread shift that we've seen from referring to people as victims to referring to them as survivors. And then we can use a broad we. So instead of talking about adversity as a sort of, in a way that makes it seem like a problem of someone who's far away, we can shift to first person pronouns. And so it's one thing to talk about, say, for example, the needs of infants and young children, but it's a different thing to talk about what we all need as we grow. And so here's just an example of when participants were given frames about children's mental health and vulnerability. So in one of the framing examples, the participants were given some framing about how children are vulnerable. And so this makes it really important to care for their mental health. That's the bar on the right. And then a second group was offered framing about how protecting children's mental health helps to build our collective prosperity, and it makes it so that all children can thrive. And so compared to controls, the group that was offered the vulnerability frame was actually less likely than before they were spoken to support policies that supported protecting children's mental health. So it actually moved them further away from wanting to help, while the collective prosperity frame actually did the opposite. So it's just an example of how this vulnerability frame doesn't motivate people to change systems or to change policies. And so finally, I just say that I think when it comes to making science accessible and making it actionable, not only does our science need to be strong, but so do the framing and the communication strategies that we're using. And so this is really going to allow us to get the right stakeholders to pay attention and to activate productive mindsets and the solution-oriented mindsets that we're all hoping for. And I think this is particularly important when we look to help stakeholders who are working across a variety of different sectors and thinking about the role that they can play in improving developmental environments and in reducing these disparities. So thinking specifically about climate change, this is an area where communication choices around science and the impact of climate change on children's early development and health, and I think connecting it to a lot of different sectors will really be key for kids. So thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I will send it back to Shruti.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. I learned so much from your talk. It was
Oh, thanks. I would
eloquent.
learn so much from you. I wish you could hear me talk. You're an expert here as well.
So lovely. I am waiting for some questions in the Q&A, but I wanted to start with one for you. What are some strategies, evidence-based strategies, even for building resilience in children to help them cope with the effects of climate change? And specifically, I'm interested in understanding from your experience, how does education for children around climate change or their bodies, as you described so nicely and clearly, play a role in kind of that resilience or coping?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I love thinking about resilience. It's like just, I don't know, it's a great topic. And so I think resilience is something that can help us all get through hardship and overcome hardship, but resilience isn't something that we're born with. And recently I heard this developmental psychologist who I really learned so much from. Her name's Elisa Pressman, and I heard her describe resilience as like knowing that a rainstorm will come, but having a rain jacket and an umbrella so that you can kind of you're better equipped to weather the storm. And so I think that just shows like resilience is built over time, but it happens as the experiences that we have interact with our own unique genetic makeup. And so that's why each of us responds to stress and adversity differently. And so we can think of resilience, I think, as like a seesaw or almost like a balancing scale, where there's a fulcrum in the middle, and then negative experiences can stack up on one side, negative exposures, and tip the scale towards bad outcomes. And then on the other side, positive experiences and positive exposures, the more those stack up, the more likely we're going to tip towards positive outcomes. And then the fulcrum in the middle, when we're born, that's sort of a genetic set point, how likely we are, based on our genetics to tip one way or the other. And there's some things that we can do to shift that fulcrum in terms of improving our own capabilities. But I think that, there's a couple of ways to tip the scale. One way to tip towards positive outcomes is to unload the negative side of the scale. So if you remove sources of stress, if you remove negative exposures, that's going to tip it, or you can load up on the positive side. And so I think your question about education and your point about like, how do we communicate with kids about the effects of climate probably adds up on the positive side if we do it well, right? I think this generation in particular, when I talk to really young kids about climate, like it's sort of like a no-brainer to them. They understand that it's important to take care of the things that they love, and they're very easily able to articulate what they love about, if they're lucky enough to be outside around green space, to be able to run and play when it's cool outside. And they're very articulate actually about the effects of things like heat on their learning. So I had a very young child say to me, like, I don't like it when it's hot in my school, my brain goes to sleep. And so, whether or not we choose to tie these things to climate, I think is a strategic framing decision that we make based on our audience. But in general, I think the more that we can unload that negative side and upload that positive side, and that includes things like education, I think the more likely we are to see those scales tip.
Thank you. That analogy was really, really vivid, and really you could see where the interventions might help and how to
Yeah.
reduce the negative side. So we have one question in the Q&A.
Okay.
Thank you for speaking with us from Matthew Schaefer. Great talk. Could you please touch on environmental and planetary health factors that impact child neurosurgical diseases and care, such as tumors, neurotoxins, and please address how to maybe combat this? And he's given some info to contact him, but
Okay.
maybe child neurosurgical diseases and tumors and neurotoxins.
Yeah, that's definitely beyond my area of expertise, Shruti. I think there's a lot of people at Chan who could probably handle that better than I could. The things that we know about neurotoxicants, we covered a lot in our discussion about water, particularly the effects of heavy metals, which are becoming more common as they're concentrated in drinking water. And then, we're increasingly learning about neurodevelopmental effects of different air pollution and exposures. And I think that body of literature continues to grow. A lot of what we know about neurodevelopmental effects of pollution, of course, all of which is being made worse by higher temperatures and by the effects of climate change, are based on what we know about outdoor influences of air pollution on health. But I think what's really underappreciated is how much outdoor air gets in. So, we spend like 90% of our time indoors. And for kids, a lot of that time is in school and in their bedrooms. And the amount of your outdoor air pollution that gets in, which again is what influences neurodevelopmental outcomes like risk of autism and attention problems and all of the different neurodevelopmental outcomes that we're learning more and more about. It really depends on the quality of the building that you're in. So, where do you have access to cooling inside? Do you need to leave your windows open? How energy efficient and tight are your windows versus, how leaky is your building? What are your neighbors doing? So if you're living in multi-unit housing, if your neighbor smokes, then you smoke, if a lot of that air passes from one unit to another. So I think that body of evidence is still growing, and it sounds like maybe our question asker knows more about the neurosurgical outcomes of these measures than I do, but it's something good to learn about, I think.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess my only contribution in adding to the
Yeah, you probably
how to
know better.
think about the question is like in terms of prenatal exposures, and developmental toxicity, at least for a lot of kind of early organ development, the first trimester is so critical for a lot of different kind of cells that are migrating to the right place and the architecture. So um, that was just one curious uh, aspect that I would contribute. And I think maybe the question asker has a lot of different experience, but as an OBGYN who performs, fertility treatments and IVF and surgeries, I think in addition, the ambient environment around the lab in the OR and, smoke inhalation and all of that is so important from a variety of aspects for the team and the patient. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll learn more and have more awareness around all of these in, future work.
Yeah, and I think your area of specialty, Shruti, in particular, like these early prenatal influences on health. I think I don't know about you, but I think that if we were able to raise kind of awareness and understanding of the power of protection during this time, like you mentioned, like neural development in the first trimester, like I don't know, I think that we can increasingly help to get that message out because it just is such I think, a chance to lean in and protect people early and just see like these benefits across the life course. Like I think that this is really a place where public health can step in and tell a really important story. But it's hard to measure these effects, right? It's hard to show how protecting people like that OR environment that you described, this like early life environment leads to improvements in neurodegenerative disease when you're elderly. That's a really hard connection to make, and so I think it's sort of like the unsung hero maybe of public health. Like if we could figure out some type of measurement for all of this, it would really, I think, be really powerful. So maybe somebody out there could do that.
Well, I would love to work with you on that.
Okay. Let's do it.
I'm sure the alumni on this call would also love to collaborate on this. And so I just wanted to take a moment and thank you for your talk and engagement, and to all of the alumni on this call and to Preeti Lakhani, and just wanted to say thank you to everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your alumni day.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for listening in.